Welcome to Asia Pacific Defence Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. Over the weekend, I managed to pick up a nasty cold, and apart from sounding muffled, it's also affected my thought processes, so this podcast might seem even less coherent than normal, and it might finish early, just depending on when I run out of energy. Now, I'm very conscious of the fact that for the last few weeks, podcasts have been dominated by Donald Trump, not surprisingly, but deliberately I'm going to give everyone a break for a while because I'm getting sick of him, and if I am, the same probably applies to all of you. I'll have to do some Trump-related stuff. You can't avoid it. But I've got a couple of positive Australian industry stories that I'll come to in a moment. But it's been a very busy week last week here in Canberra, including German Defence Minister Boris Pistorius speaking at the National Press Club. And what a class act he was. And following that, the next day, there was a major sovereign capability seminar focusing largely on AUKUS, hosted by UNSW and former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. It is a repeat of the one that occurred 12 months ago that was a very useful data exchange forum. But firstly to Minister Boris Pistorius, and what a breath of fresh air he is. You can find his full address on ABC iView, and I recommend you all watch it. And by the way, speaking of watching things, I hope you all watched retired Air Vice Marshal John Blackburn being interviewed by Tim Lester. I recommended that in the last podcast. He goes into a lot of detail about the current fuel crisis and government neglect on both sides of politics for more than a decade. Anyway, getting to Minister Pistorius, he spoke honestly and candidly, unlike either our Prime Minister, Defence Minister or Foreign Minister, saying that the Iran invasion is a mess, there is no exit strategy, and Germany isn't going to be drawn into it. If only our own politicians could speak with such purpose and clarity. As it happened, my question to him at about the 40-minute mark was about support for Ukraine, or in this country, declining support for Ukraine. And again, he politely but firmly expressed his concerns that the US was losing interest, while at the same time a combination of the US lifting sanctions and global oil prices increasing was taking pressure off what had been a very shaky Russian economy. He also referred to the shortage of guided weapons that I've mentioned in my podcasts. Basically, the US is running out, and Australia needs to be doing something about it now. I can assure you, when it comes to resupply, it won't be Australia that's on the top of the list. It'll be the monarchies of the Middle East. They're the ones that have been giving Trump billions of dollars. You know, MBS in Saudi Arabia and all of that sort of stuff. We will be a long way down the queue. And people will get sick and tired of me saying this. We should have been in discussions with South Korea and Europeans at least a couple of years ago. Anyway, at the end of the Boris Pistorius address and Q&A session, I was speaking with three members of the German press corps and remarked on the fact that he was a very impressive man. And they said, yes, that because of his direct and honest style, he's very popular in Germany, that they added his personal popularity rating is even slightly higher than that of Chancellor Merz, who's travelling pretty well. So clearly the honest style of Pistorius resonates with a lot of people. I then asked, because Pistorius and his Australian counterpart, Defence Minister Richard Marles, held a joint media conference at Parliament House, I asked them what they thought of our Defence Minister. To which, being Germans, they very politely thought about it for a moment, and then one of them said, well, we observe he manages to talk a lot, but without actually saying anything. I thought, yes, bingo, that's a good summary. Talks a lot without actually saying anything. Now, the day after that, There was the Malcolm Turnbull seminar that I have referred to, a day-long event. I wasn't able to attend all of it, but I was there for the first half, which contained speakers such as Peter Briggs, former or Rear Admiral retired, former submarine squadron commander, Marcus Hellier, who I've referred to before, the economic analyst who understands more about the defence budget than the Defence Department itself does, a number of academics, very, very rich data gathering. I think that I can summarise this one pretty much along the same ones as the first one, saying that there was no sort of, outright ideological hostility towards AUKUS, but there was a great deal of uncertainty and a great deal of scepticism on the ability of the project to ever deliver nuclear-powered submarines, second-hand or new, to Australia. And here, this is, I think I've commented on this before, an interesting sort of split between the way that, well, we'll call them opposing sides of the argument. In fact, it's shades of grey. A lot of people in the middle, I'm a skeptic, but not opposed outright. I mean, if nuclear-powered submarines ever do arrive, they will bolster Australia's deterrent capability. So I'm not saying don't do it. My questions are all around the timetable, the cost, the risks associated with it, that sort of thing. Anyway, Peter Briggs, once again, I mean, he's always worth listening to because he's such a subject matter expert in all of this. He has crunched again US construction numbers and has pointed out the obvious using facts and figures. Oh, sorry, that reminds me what I wanted to say. The two sides of the argument. The AUKUS skeptics, as I say, myself and Peter Briggs, use facts and information to justify our concerns. On the other side, the people who are enthusiastic about AUKUS, they're the ones that rely just on raw emotion, just this sort of appeal that, well, this is so obviously in the national interest, you have to get on board. Of course it's going to happen. The Americans wouldn't be making this effort if they weren't fully committed, and because they're committed, it's going to occur. No, not necessarily at all. Sorry, I interrupted myself. Getting back to Peter Briggs, construction numbers of submarines that by his maths, which is very hard to disagree with, the US has to lift their production rate by 400%. And that is because the newer Block 5 Virginia-class submarines, which are coming online now, are 20% larger than the previous Virginia-class, and on top of that are the new 20,000-ton Columbia-class ballistic missile-firing submarines. When you put all of that together, the US submarine industrial base, to meet these very ambitious targets, has to go from producing 8,000 tons of generic submarine to now 20,000 tons of generic submarine. Yes, the US has tipped a lot of money into this, and Australia is making our non-refundable $4.6 billion contribution, but just tipping more money at something doesn't automatically fix a whole lot of supply chain and workforce issues. Now, I'll also mention that there was a Department of Defence representative there. I'll leave his name out of it, but you can find it online. It's irrelevant in the sense that this is about the information conveyed rather than personalities. And unfortunately, the information that came from the government representative was quite dissatisfying. Again, a lot of it was just really all of the old platitudes that we've heard before, that this is industrial uplift in 3 countries. No, it's not. It's industrial uplift in the US and in the UK. There's no industrial uplift here, apart from pouring concrete at HMAS Sterling, maybe 1 or 2 other small contracts. He also really lost the audience when he repeated what has become, in the last year, one of the government's talking points, that Australia has reviewed AUKUS. I've dealt with this before, but I'll do it again. No, the government has not reviewed AUKUS. So my question to the gentleman was, regarding the AUKUS review, who conducted it, what were its terms of reference, what were its findings, and where can I get a copy? Now, it might have just slipped his mind, but I think very tellingly, he sort of bundled up all of the questions together at the end. He chose not to answer that until I and a number of other audience members interjected. He tried, first of all, to talk about the US report, the one conducted by Elbridge Colby that's classified. We said we know all about that. We want to know about the Australian report. And then he defaulted to saying, well, it was looked at by the Defence Strategic Review, and therefore, they tick that box. I'll say again, this is not a review. Even if what he is saying is true, correct, I suppose it must be, it sounds like the people conducting the independent review, Sir Angus Houston and Stephen Smith, former Defence Minister, might have discussed it over a cup of coffee. That seems to have been about the amount of detail that it went into. So, this just adds to a pattern of evasion and deception, starting with things like, people will remember this from a couple of years ago, that I and a couple of other journalists started questioning the government's figure that we were making a cash transfer of $3 billion to the US industrial base. Long-term listeners will know that turned out to be an untruth. We were making a contribution of $3 billion US dollars, which is 4.7 billion Australian. The US dollar figure was conveniently left out of the equation. We've had a number of other evasions and omissions. We were told the East Coast submarine base, that we would know the location of that. No, we don't. That's become politically too touchy, so we aren't going to find about that. We were told that we'll learn a bit more about how the highly radioactive parts are going to be disposed of in Australia. No, we're not going to learn about that either. So the government's record and the record of the bureaucracy has been one of evasion, obscurity, and half-truths. As many members of the audience reflected during the day, we learn much, much more about what's going on about AUKUS from the United States and UK sources than we do from our own government. That is just plain wrong. And I'll also say that the fellow from the Department of Defence who was fielding the difficult questions, that should actually have been Honorary Colonel Richard Marles, but presumably he decided in his usually courageous way that it needed to instead be handled by a bureaucrat. And I'll stop with the Honorary Colonel stuff soon, because that doesn't serve any purpose other than highlighting this government's ridiculous attachment to the Trump administration. But it's worth pointing out that he shares that rank with an even more famous person, namely Colonel Sanders of Kentucky Fried Chicken fame, who was twice awarded the rank, first in 1935, and for some obscure reason that was reaffirmed in 1949. Colonel Sanders was given his honorary rank rather obviously for the services to the Kentucky economy, having developed a new method for deep frying chicken during the Great Depression, as well as the herbs and spices coating each piece for which he is famous. Now, the reason why Richard Marles has been so honoured is much more obscure, since he was made a colonel in 2003, which was well before he entered Parliament in 2007. Well, one of life's little mysteries, I suppose. But before leaving Richard Marles alone completely, I note that it's almost the end of March. Today's question for the class: what hasn't happened by the end of March? Anyone need more time? No. Okay, the answer is the signing of the contract for C-3000 for the purchase of 3 Megami frigates built in Japan by Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. I wouldn't usually mention a literal non-event, except Minister Marles and to a lesser extent Minister Conroy. They made such a song and dance, made such a huge amount of noise that this project was such an example of success that everything will go to schedule, starting with contract signature before the end of March 2026. Well, there's 24 hours to go. It seems that they have failed to meet their own artificial self-imposed deadline, and if I were a sensationalist, which actually I am not, the headline would be "Government fails to deliver Megami frigates on schedule." The reality is that a delay of a few weeks is neither here nor there, and a smarter government wouldn't have been so adamant, so convinced of their own infallibility, that they would have boasted about meeting the March deadline. Now, what has gone wrong? I don't know, because the entire project remains shrouded in secrecy because the government refuses to lift the non-disclosure agreements they made all of the parties sign, which makes any mention of this project a jailable offence. I'll do my best to find out exactly what's going on, although I'm a bit pessimistic. The attitude of Japan, Inc., has also changed now that they've won the contract or are about to sign the contract. They are no longer that interested in talking with anyone. If they persist in this attitude, this project will go the same way as the attack-class submarines for similar reasons. Someone in the system will come up with a brighter idea. MHI will have squandered all of their goodwill, and they might end up in the rubbish bin of history. And sticking with shipbuilding, first of the Australian industry visits was to BAE Systems at Osborn. I mentioned 2 journalists, myself and Andrew Green, went along. And I'll just mention that the small-minded defence official who tried to block our visit is also involved in C3000. So maybe that's connected to the delayed contract signature. Now, this will be a major article in the May edition of the magazine. The visit to the shipyard involved a tour of the site, which was very impressive, the amount of work taking place, and then an extensive Q&A session. And I got a lot of data, so it'll take me some time to go through it all. In essence, my concerns about a schedule have been partially addressed because it circles back to the fact that this is the first-of-class warship, and because of Australia's, once again, boom and bust approach to naval shipbuilding, BAE Systems has had to start from scratch. The pace is picking up. Once the first ship has been launched, deliveries will then take place at 18-month intervals, which is about the same as what is being achieved in the United States, which is pretty good, but still short of the 6 destroyers a year that China is producing. And finally, with an eye on the clock, there was a separate visit in Victoria, courtesy of Penske Automotive, a US company that has taken over the business in Australia of MTU, the great German diesel engine manufacturer. You can find MTUs on land platforms like the Boxer cavalry reconnaissance vehicle, Huntsman self-propelled howitzers, Redback infantry fighting vehicles. They are on just about all naval surface platforms. The company does some other stuff as well that I'll go into more detail about. What I can very happily announce is that the combination of Penske and MTU has achieved pretty much 100% self-sufficiency for the support and overhaul of diesel engines, naval and land domain military diesel engines in Australia. They say we could be cut off from the outside world for years and it would not be affecting the availability of any of those engines because they have invested a lot in facilities and people, and we don't have to worry about what's going on elsewhere in the globe when it comes to keeping the vital diesel engines running. It's a good industry policy story, and again, I'll be elaborating on that. Now, I'm just going to conclude by saying I did notice a couple of days ago that our Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, said, and I'll quote, that the stable, predictable world of ever-expanding free trade is gone and it will not be returning any time soon. This is excellent progress, an admission far too late in the piece that the old world order has gone. But the Prime Minister and his cabinet need to ask the most obvious question: why is it that the old world order has gone? And I'll explore that in detail in the next podcast, and I'll also just briefly mention Andrew Hastie, the opposition spokesman for infrastructure, has come out not for the first time questioning our relationship with the United States, saying that it's clearly a mistake that they have invaded Iran. The political dynamics of this are very interesting and, again, will be the topic of a future podcast. Thank you very much for listening. Sorry about my muffled tones. Goodbye for now and see you next time.
That's today's Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.